So this is a short video going over homework number 7 and trying to help you get started if you're having some issues with global variables and modifying the text of an HTML element. So I've got this sample application which is making use of global variables and events. And it's also making use of something called document.getElementById, which we'll talk about later. We'll talk about it in more depth, but you can feel free to use it. What document.getElementById is doing is it's getting an HTML element. So it's programmatically getting an HTML element. And then in JavaScript, once we get that element, we can modify it. So for this example, I'm modifying the HTML of an element with an ID of button state. But I can do a lot of other things, like I can modify the color. I can do a lot of different things. Okay, so here in my program, I've created 3 buttons and a div. If I click the button called Set State to True, I'm going to set a global variable to true. If I click this other button called Set State to False, then I'm going to set a global variable to false. And if I click this button called Set State, then I'm going to display the state inside this div element with an ID of button state. Okay, so how did I do this? So again, I've created these 3 buttons and a div. I've wired up the onClick event for the button. So this is going to call, when I click the button, it's going to call a function called setToTrue. When I click this one, I'm going to call a function called setToFalse. And when I click this last button, I'm going to call a function called setState. So here on the right are my 3 functions, or my 2 functions, actually my 3 functions, And I've created this global variable. It's a Boolean variable, and it is initialized to false. So this is a global variable, meaning that everything in this whole JavaScript page has access to this variable. If I were to declare a variable inside a function called setToTrue, then that would be referred to as a local variable. I would only be able to access that variable inside the function called setToTrue. But instead, I have this variable declared outside the function, so it's global. Anybody can modify it. SetToTrue can modify it. SetToFalse can modify it. Okay, so what happens is when I have this button, Set State to True, I've wired up the onClick event. So when the user clicks it, I'm going to call setToTrue. So here I have my function setToTrue, and it sets the global variable to true. If I click Set State to False, then I'm going to call a function called setToFalse, and I'm going to set the global variable to false. So that's how I can set the state from false to true, back and forth. So now the more complicated one is display state. So when I click Get State, it's going to display the state. So what it does is it calls this function called display state, and I declare a local variable called myDiv. So this is local to just this function, meaning set state to false would not have access to the variable called myDiv. And then I call document.getElementById. And again, we'll talk about this more in a few weeks, but this is programmatically getting the div element with an ID of button state. So now I have button state, and I can do a whole bunch of cool things with it. But what you see that I'm doing here is I'm modifying the HTML of the div element. And I'm setting the HTML to the variable global variable. So that's it. So now let's try it. Let's look at the UI. Here's my UI. So I'm going to click Set State to True. Get State displays true. I click Set State to False, and it displays false. Again, Set State to True. Get State displays true. So just as a review, I click Set to True. Actually it's labeled Set State to True. That's what's being displayed. So when I click that, I call my function set to true. I set the global variable to true. I click this one, call set to false. I set the global variable to false. And then I click display state. I then programmatically get this div. And then I modify the inner HTML of it. And here's the w3schools.com site for get element by ID. And here you see they're getting the element for an element with an ID of demo. It could be anything. It could be a button. It could be a div. It could be anything. But the element has an ID of demo. And then let's see what they're doing down here. So they are setting the style to red. So that's something we could have done too. So actually, let's just for the heck of it, let's do this. We're going to modify the style to a color. Okay, so again, this is something we'll talk about more in the future, but what I'm going to do is modify the background color. So my div dot style dot background color equals green. So now get the state, so it displays green. So again, we'll talk about this more, but this is really cool. We're getting the element and then we're modifying the properties of it. So that's it. If you have any questions, just post it to this forum and I should be able to respond today, or which is Sunday. Just don't post too late.